Two's my word, fam.
Oh!
What's good, y'all? Welcome back to another video, man. Today we've got a video called How Toronto Accidentally Built 3 Downtowns. Now, me personally, I ain't never been to Toronto. I've only seen the things from online. I see videos, I see pictures, and apparently there's a lot that be going on in Toronto. So if I got some Torontans in the comments, man, let me know how y'all feeling, bro. Teach me something about Toronto. You feel me? We on the educational timing. Let's see why Toronto accidentally built 3 downtowns. Let's see.
This is Toronto, a city known for its towering CN Tower, its huge basketball culture, and famous celebrities like Drake. Sitting on the northern shore of Lake Ontario in Canada, it has become...
1 second, bro. I don't know what this quality is, bro. What the hell?
Become one of the most recognized cities in the world. But hidden in plain sight is something weird. When you look at Toronto from a distance, the skyline feels off. Instead of one clear cluster of tall buildings, Toronto is split into multiple skylines. There's a skyline in downtown, one in midtown, and another in uptown, each one separated by stretches of lower buildings and wide city blocks. So why is that? In this video, we're going to explain the unusual reason Toronto has such a weird skyline, and the choices.
Also, 1 second, chat. Who's to decide that you can only have one downtown in a, or like not one downtown, but like why can't you have high buildings in multiple places? You feel me? I'm not an architect. I'm not a city builder. I'm not an architect, and I'm not a city builder. So maybe they do have their own reasons. I'm genuinely asking what they are.
That led to it. We'll also explore parts of the city's planning to better understand how Toronto ended up this way and what it can still show us today. Long before Toronto became the city people recognize today, it was a shoreline and a crossroads. The north edge of Lake Ontario offered a protected harbor, and the rivers nearby created natural routes inland. For thousands of years, indigenous communities lived, traded, and traveled through this region, using trails that connected the lake to the upper Great Lakes. Even the name Toronto points back to that earlier world, tied to the idea of trees standing in water and the fishing systems that once shaped the area. But the modern city began when the British started thinking about defense and control. In 1793, Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe chose this harbor as the site for a new capital of Upper Canada, partly because it felt safer than exposed settlements closer to the American border. He renamed the place York and ordered Fort York built near the water, turning the shoreline into a military anchor. From the start, the settlement was small and muddy, and it stayed that way for years because the land was hard to build on and the population grew slowly. As more settlers arrived in the early 1800s, York began stretching beyond its earliest grid, but it still felt fragile. That became obvious during the War of 1812.
The War of 1812, bro. I had to look this shit up, bro, because I heard about this shit in a TV show. That shit was hilarious, bro. It was just like an ongoing joke. I don't know. I think it was like Ned the classifier or some shit. But bro, they was joking about the War of 1812, and that ongoing joke was just like, it was hilarious, bro. Anytime I hear that shit, it just makes me laugh.
American forces attacked and occupied the town in 1813. After the war ended, immigration and commerce picked up, and the muddy garrison town started acting like a real city. By 1834, York was incorporated as the City of Toronto, a name that helped the growing place shed its older reputation and claim a bigger identity. In the decades that followed, Toronto's growth was shaped by movement. Roads like Yonge Street pushed north from the shoreline and became spines for settlement, while railways later tied the city to the rest of the continent. Over time, the waterfront also changed as industry and rail infrastructure expanded along the lake, building new land and new barriers at the same time. That brought jobs and trade, but it also created a city that increasingly faced inward instead of outward toward the water. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, Toronto had become Ontario's key economic and political center, and its population surged as factories, offices, and neighborhoods multiplied. Yet, even as downtown grew stronger, the city was already planting the seeds for something unusual. Streetcar lines and later cars made it easier to live farther from the core, and surrounding communities began developing their own commercial strips and local centers instead of feeding everything into one downtown. After World War II, that pattern accelerated. Toronto absorbed waves of immigrants and expanded fast, while new subdivisions spread outward in every direction. At the same time, governing the region became more complicated because growth did not stay inside one city boundary. In the 1950s, the creation of metropolitan Toronto linked the old city with surrounding boroughs like North York, Scarborough, and Etobicoke, which were rapidly turning into major population centers with their own roads, shopping districts, and employment hubs.
Damn.
Meanwhile, Toronto's downtown kept climbing. By the 1970s and 1980s, the financial district around Bay Street became the country's dominant money center, and office towers rose high enough to interfere with broadcast signals. That practical problem helped spark one of Toronto's biggest symbols, the CN Tower, built in the 1970s as both infrastructure and statement. Soon after, large projects in the railway lands area, including Skydome, helped push downtown into a more intense mix of finance and entertainment. As time went on, Toronto kept growing upward, with more and more skyscrapers rising across downtown. Today, it has one of the most iconic skylines in the world. But here's the thing, the skyline you see here doesn't stop downtown. Parts of it are scattered across the city. There's one in downtown, one in midtown, and one in uptown, which gives Toronto a weird, broken look from a distance. So why is that? And why doesn't the city have one main skyline instead of these separate clusters? Toronto is one of the few major North American cities where the skyline doesn't feel like one center that simply grew outward. Downtown is still the main cluster, but it isn't the only one.
That's a very
Toronto
beautiful
also
shot.
built a second skyline in Midtown, around Yonge and Eglinton, and a third in Uptown, at North York Center near Yonge and Shepherd. From a distance, it gives the city a strange shape, because the height is split into three separate towerscapes instead of one continuous wall of buildings. And the reason those skyscrapers erupted in these three exact places comes down to three forces: transit engineering, political borders, and neighborhood protectionism. Downtown became the first skyline for the most traditional reason possible. It was already the economic anchor. Union Station was the rail hub, Lake Ontario was the shipping edge, and the city's financial and business core formed right where those systems met. Skyscrapers appeared here because commerce needed a place to stack itself. So when the subway opened in 1954, it simply reinforced it as the place where the most jobs would always concentrate. But what's more interesting is where downtown stops. The skyline runs north until it hits a hard wall around Bloor Street, and then the city changes suddenly. The towers thin out, the streets and the neighborhoods become quieter and wealthier. And that's because north of Bloor sits some of Toronto's most protected residential territory. And for decades, those neighborhoods fought hard against high-rise expansion. So downtown kept rising, but it couldn't keep spreading. That block is the reason Midtown exists. Yonge and Eglinton became a skyline because it was engineered into one. For nearly 20 years, from 1954 until the early 70s, the subway ended at Eglinton. That essentially made it a terminal. Every morning, buses from the northern suburbs poured commuters into that one intersection, forcing thousands of people to transfer there daily. And once that kind of foot traffic exists, everything follows it, and developers, naturally, smell a permanent stream of demand. By the time the subway finally extended farther north, the area was already functioning like a mini downtown. But the reason Midtown got skyscrapers wasn't only demand. There's something else as well, and that's containment. Yonge Eglinton sits next to some of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city, and those areas refuse to absorb density themselves. The compromise Toronto fell into was simple. Concentrate the height right at the intersection, then keep the surrounding streets frozen in place. Midtown's skyline became sort of like a pressure valve, taking in growth that the nearby neighborhoods would not accept. Then there's Uptown, North York Center, and this is one of the least organic of all. Downtown grew from history. Midtown grew from transit necessity. Uptown grew from political will. Back when North York was its own city, its leaders didn't want to stay a bedroom suburb that existed only to feed workers into downtown. They wanted jobs and tax revenue to stay local, and that push created a skyline by force, centered along Yonge Street between Shepherd and Finch, in a location that also had direct access to Highway 401. It was designed to work for the kind of commuter Toronto was producing, someone who could drive in, work in a tower, and still be connected to the subway. But this skyline also has a strange shape. It runs like a narrow strip, north to south, and then ends abruptly. That's because the neighborhoods to the east and west stayed protected, so the towers were allowed only in a tight corridor, like a downtown that was squeezed into a single line. And once these three skylines existed, they created another question.
Oh, what the heck?
Why didn't the rest of Toronto follow? Because in most other areas, the city either downzoned, protected the streets, or simply never gave the location a reason to go vertical. Stations like St. Clair and Lawrence sat inside stable residential zones with enormous political influence, which kept towers out. The Danforth was treated differently too, with much more low-rise zoning meant to preserve its street-level village feel. And in places like Scarborough and Etobicoke, the city tried to create new centers, but the growth stayed car-dependent and spread out, leaving clusters of towers surrounded by parking lots instead of a true skyline. So Toronto ended up with three skylines because the city forced growth into a few approved zones and then built transit lines that made those zones explode. Which sounds efficient until it creates a new problem. Toronto has three skylines: downtown, midtown, uptown. And that only works if there's a strong transit system tying them together, because these clusters depend on each other every single day. People live in one, work in another, and pass through a third without even thinking about it. The TTC, or Toronto Transit Commission, is what makes that possible. In 2024, the system carried about 420 million trips. Roughly 204 million were buses, 181 million were subway, and 35 million were streetcars. Those numbers sound strong, but the real issue is how close the TTC operates to the edge. This system doesn't have much extra capacity. When one piece slows down, the delays spread outward fast. That's why Toronto's transit problem is less about coverage and more about reliability. Trains get delayed, surface routes bunch up, and riders end up waiting far longer than the schedule claims. Over time, that breaks the entire promise of the network.
Damn.
A system built to connect three dense zones starts behaving like a fragile bridge between them. Then, the funding problem shows up. Toronto runs the TTC on fares more than almost any major city. Riders cover around 70% of operating costs.
Damn. That's crazy. Los Angeles is 29%. What the hell? Oh! Why are they so strict, bro? Bro, I don't... Yeah, never mind. Let me not say too much.
Which makes the system unusually vulnerable. If ridership dips, the budget takes a hit. When the budget takes a hit, service gets weaker. And once service gets weaker, more people start looking for exits. That's where traffic enters the story. Toronto is dense enough that it can't survive a large shift back to cars. The roads between these clusters were never designed to absorb that many extra trips. So when the TTC slips, the entire city slows down with it. And once that starts happening, Toronto's three skylines design starts feeling like a gamble. Because at the end of the day, transit is how Toronto stays affordable. If people can't move freely across the city, then housing pressure doesn't spread out evenly. And that brings us to our next section: housing. Toronto's housing crisis looks confusing from the outside, because the prices are finally falling, yet the city still feels less affordable every year. In late 2025, the benchmark home price in the Greater Toronto Area fell to about $942,000,
wow,
and condos dropped more than 20% from their 2022 peak. On paper, that sounds like relief. Still, most people don't feel it, because the math of living here never really came back down to earth. A typical household is now spending around 2/3 of its before-tax income on housing costs. That kind of ratio creates a city where normal life starts breaking down. Rent shows the same problem. A one-bedroom in Toronto can sit around $2,500 plus a month. which means a person earning a median salary gets squeezed the moment they sign a lease. Meanwhile, families get pushed even harder, because the housing Toronto builds the most often is the exact kind families need the least. The city keeps adding small units, and then acts surprised when people with kids can't make it work. So why did it get this bad? A big piece is that Toronto treated housing like a financial product. Condos became the machine that fed the whole system. Investors bought a huge share of units, pre-construction sales became the fuel that financed new projects, and the skyline kept rising because the money kept flowing. Then interest rates climbed, carrying costs jumped, and that investor model started failing all at once. And by 2025, new condo sales collapsed to around 1,600 units for the year, which is almost unheard of for a city this size. Developers usually need most of a building sold before they can even start construction. So when buyers disappear, the pipeline shuts off. That's why Toronto can have more listings today and still be walking toward a shortage tomorrow. At the same time, the city's zoning rules kept making the crisis worse. For decades, huge areas of Toronto were locked into low-rise housing only. Density was allowed in a few places and blocked almost everywhere else. So demand didn't spread across the city like a normal gradient. It got forced into tight pockets, and those pockets became tower zones. That pattern helped create the housing squeeze in two ways. First, it made land near transit wildly valuable, because those were some of the only places where building big was allowed. Second, it created a sharp jump from houses to high-rises, which pushed construction toward expensive projects that depend on perfect financing conditions. Now those conditions are gone. Housing starts in 2025 fell sharply, and the early signs point to a supply cliff in the years ahead, because fewer projects are getting launched today. Toronto basically hit a moment where the city is still expensive, still growing, and still desperate for more homes, while the main engine that produced them is stalling. And once housing stops functioning, it spreads into everything else people do every day, because the cost of shelter reshapes commutes, grocery bills, and who can even stay in the city long enough to build a life.
Right.
Toronto,
or leisure or anything else. Like if you can't afford to pay rent, bro, who's thinking about going out and getting dinner or going to birthday parties or whatever else, bro? Like if you can't afford rent, like GG's, bro.
Was built on growth and ambition. Those choices helped the city rise fast, attract people from everywhere, and turn into one of the biggest cities in North America. But that same growth created something strange. Instead of one clear skyline, Toronto ended up with multiple skylines spread across the city. Downtown, Midtown, and Uptown all feel like their own mini-city centers. And today, Toronto is still changing, trying to connect these pieces and keep up with how fast it keeps expanding. But here's the weird part. Toronto isn't the only major city with a skyline that feels wrong. There's one city in America where the skyline is so hated, people can't stop talking about it. And somehow, it's one of the biggest cities in the entire country. Why does the fifth largest city in the US have the most hated skyline in America?
Oh, damn, I don't even know. I just want to know what city that is, but I guess I gotta click the video to find out. W Marketing, man. W Marketing. You're not gonna get me today, but W Marketing. But yeah, that was a good lesson, man. Like, I didn't know a lot of that stuff about Toronto, especially since I've never been there, right? Like, that might be the next city that we touch, man. Like I said, we just came out of LA, man. We might have to go see Toronto, see what they're saying out there, you feel me? But it's very interesting. I love looking into like the cause and effect of things, because these are things that you don't really think about, right? You got the transit system. Once the transit system breaks down, you know, people want to get cars, and that fucks up traffic, or that fucks up the job force. Like the cause and effect, like you don't really look how far that goes. And it's interesting to look at things like that and just be aware of how things play out in real life. So shout out to the creator of this video, man. I appreciate that insight, man. Yeah, man, that was educational nonsense for you. And thank you guys for tuning in. If you guys enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. And I will catch y'all in the next one. Peace out.
All right. Yeah. I'm getting gritty on these niggas. I'm getting gritty on these bitches. Here we go, another talking again. Yeah. I'm getting gritty on these niggas. I'm getting gritty on these bitches. Here we go, another talking again. Yeah. I'm getting gritty on these niggas. I'm getting gritty on these bitches.